AdYack.
You're listening to AdYack. AdYack is the official podcast of the AAF Greater Lehigh Valley Ad Club. Our mission is to inspire creativity and enhance the professional development of the advertising and marketing communities where we live and work. I'm your host, Bill Childs, and I'll talk with artists, designers, writers, directors, photographers, along with those who work in a creative capacity. Our aim here is to serve as a creative resource to help you stay informed, entertained, and above all, inspired. But first, I want to thank ASR Media. We appreciate your support and collaboration. One of the topics I love to discuss on AdYack is leadership. Today on the podcast, I will explore this topic in depth with best-selling authors Katie Desiderio and Michael Frino. Frino oversees human capital development for a Fortune 500 company, a leadership author, a performance researcher, and an adjunct professor. Desiderio is an assistant vice president of corporate educational partnerships, a tenured professor of management at Moravian University, a partner in learning, and now a Wall Street Journal best-selling author. The duo have co-authored an excellent new book about leadership and transformational growth that looks to bees for its inspiration. The book is called The BeeKeeper, Pollinating Your Organization for Transformative Growth. Katie and Michael sketched out the original concept behind their first book after publishing in academic journals for over a decade, since earning their doctorate degrees in organizational learning and leadership. Little did they know then, but 18 days after their pizza box brainstorm, UN World Bee Day was established to protect and preserve our great pollinators who provide growth for all of us. The book uses the story of an inspiring beekeeper and how we can all learn from how bees structure and operate their hives. We talk about organizational structure, how we can all take better care of each other at work, and how big things will happen when we all work towards a common goal. I've read many business books over the years, and this one is at the top of my recommended list. Fun fact, I was introduced to Katie for the first time in May of 2017 when she gave a commencement address during my daughter's graduation from Moravian University. It was while listening to her meaningful words about enjoying the present moment and feeling grateful that I could shift my mood. Even though I was upset about having terrible seats and being soaked from the rain that fell earlier in the day, her impactful words helped me change my mindset. She allowed me to witness and celebrate my daughter's accomplishments with the proper attitude. To me, that's why Katie is such a great leader. We talk about that commencement address, the power of positive change, growth mindsets, creativity, and company culture, and how we can all learn what it means to place ourselves at the core of learning and growth for people in our organization. Prepare to be inspired, entertained, and enlightened. Here is my AdYack with Katie Desiderio and Michael Frino.
All right. Well, welcome, guys. This is exciting. Today on the podcast on AdYack is Katie Desiderio and Michael Frino, co-authors of a wonderful book that I read over the summer called The BeeKeeper. And I'm excited to have you guys here because this, I love the topic of leadership. Creativity, leadership, marketing, branding, all of it. It all goes together. So welcome, guys, to the podcast.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
So I want to start with Katie. I know you from your work at Moravian, and I've spoken in your class several times. Michael, I don't know you, so why don't we start with you, Michael? Give me a little background story, a bio of your work history and how you got to where you are today.
Sure. So happy to be here. Thanks for having me. I work in the sales space, so I've been a sales guy for 25 years now. Started off in the benefits payroll industry, moved into pharmaceutical sales and then medical device sales. And more recently, I've taken on some roles in leadership development. So work, in corporate America, running leadership development, management development. And so, my background really goes, when I met Katie through academics, we met during our doctorate program. So her and I have been publishing for a long time together, and our relationship then transformed into like, hey, let's think about writing a book and not just do academic journals. And that's kind of the impetus for, how we ended up writing this book together. But I do work in leadership development space, organizational development.
Awesome. Thank you. All right, Katie, how about you?
Yeah, so as you mentioned, Bill, I work as a faculty member in the School of Business at Moravian University. I've been there since 2009. And I also do, leadership development consulting work. And in that space, and kind of where my two worlds collide, I'm able to have kind of one foot in industry and then one foot in like the kind of scholarship space. And that's played a pivotal role in, to Mike's point, in the way that we've written, really kind of combining a scholar practitioner approach to academic journals, always saying like, we want the transfer, we want people to be able to use it. But then what really inspired the approach that we took in writing a leadership fable, which we're excited to talk about today.
Yeah, I really got into the book. Once I started reading it, I couldn't stop, which was, so
we love to hear that.
Story of, Katie, how you and I met. Michael, I think you're going to get a kick out of this, although maybe you'll be like, no, that makes sense. So my daughter, my first daughter graduated from Moravian and went to her graduation. It was in 2017. And, these graduations can tend to get a little long with, the reading of the names and everything, right? I'm there to hear one name, right? So this day, it was torrential rain, pouring torrential rain. We get there, we're a little late, and we can't find parking. So the day is already starting to kind of like unwind. And for whatever reason, I'm in a mood. I'm just cranky. I can just feel it coming on, and I'm trying to keep a happy, disposition for my daughter's graduation, but it's not working. My feet are getting soaked while we're walking to the gym. We get into the gym and we're sitting on bleachers. I'm sitting on these like wooden bleachers and I'm like, oh my God, this is where I'm going to be sitting for the next 4 hours. Right. So the ceremony kind of starts and everything. And I'm just like, I'm dreading this. I don't know why. I'm just dreading it. And then all of a sudden they introduce Katie. And I can't even see her. That's how far back I am. And she starts doing an exercise with everyone about breathing and mindfulness. And right away, I'm like, what the heck is going on? Right. Like I didn't expect to like be closing my eyes and picturing, she walked us through it. It was amazing. And it was this whole thing about, think about how amazing this day is. And you're here for this, and be mindful, be present. And it shook me out of my funk, And I know you did the rest of the talk and what you did, and I enjoyed the day. You kind of, and then I sought you out afterwards because I was writing a column at the time for the Morning Call, a weekly column on creativity in business, and I said I want to do a column on you, and we did a column called "Finding Sunshine Through a Rainy Day," and that's how we met. So I met her through a mindfulness exercise at a graduation ceremony. That's how I met you.
Universe moment, right?
Right. If that's not like the universe saying you guys should like probably like know each other. I don't know. Yeah. So Michael, just by me knowing that you know Katie and you co-authored a book together, you're in my tribe now. So
oh, thank you. Yeah, not surprised about that too. She's helped me through many of those situations.
It's amazing. Okay, let's get into this. I want to find out how did the book come together? What was the genesis of the book, and how did you two decide that you're going to write it together? Because that's not an easy thing. Usually, writing sometimes is a very solitary act, So how did you guys manage just to kind of work together to write the book? And really the second part or the first part of that question was, what was the genesis of the book? What made you want to write it?
Yeah, so I think Mike mentioned, we've been working together for over a decade, co-authoring, collaborating, right? Kind of reimagining. We recognize in the course of, writing together that, this is kind of like, and we draw on this a little bit, is like the deep level diversity attributes of humans, right? So Mike and I, same training, right? Went through the same doctoral program, right? Align in so many ways, but look at the world and, the way that we approach things in life, the way we prioritize energy, different. And so there's a space for us to kind of be present as we learn about each other. And I think in that space, that's helped us to imagine, where we've gotten in the progression of our writing together, but also in this space of, the BeeKeeper coming to life. And so, I really started, and I kind of came to Mike and said, I have to write a book for my next promotion at Moravian University to go up for full professor, like, what do you think about that? And at first he was like, oh, well, like, let's talk about it. And we started talking about a traditional leadership book. And this is kind of a funny story, Bill. Mike and I live thousands of miles away from each other. He's in South Florida and I'm in Pennsylvania. And we were both in Chicago for work for different reasons, like 30 minutes apart. We're like, we have to get together for dinner. Let's meet in the middle. We'll have Chicago pizza. Let's talk about this book. And we sat down, and it was really Mike, right, who was like, what about bees? So I was telling him that in my consulting space, I was hearing a lot of like resonance with storytelling. And he was like, what about bees? Like, bees help things grow. And so we got on this kick, and we literally have the image of the back of the pizza box where we drew out kind of what this book could look like. And so we saved it. We were like, okay, well, this might be a really cool concept, that maybe we think about a story and we use the undertone of learning from bees to kind of pull in our leadership theories, right? The undertone of what those takeaways could be, but in a way that's like digestible and people can kind of like read it and immediately put it into action. And then we left Chicago, and 18 days later, like, Mike sends me a text message and it's like UN World Bee Day. And he was like, oh my, like, talk about universe, right?
Mhm.
Like, the bees are talking to us. And so it really just spiraled. Like, we were inspired. Things kind of just started to make sense and fall into place of all of the discussions that happened like the previous year. And we just like really kind of dove in 2 feet. So Mike, did I miss anything there?
No, that was spot on. It definitely universe
Yeah.
moment. So yeah.
It's amazing. It really, there's so many business books, so many leadership books out there, right? And I don't know, like, and I know a lot about them, and I read a lot about them, of them. I read them, and this one it just seeped in. It just cut through like all that noise, and I started reading it, and I just got captivated. It just, I can't. It just pulled me in. I really enjoyed this, the way you wove the story. With each chapter being, the 13 be vulnerable, be appreciative, be grateful. And then how she's the main character is kind of like at this farm taking a vacation, but then sending back the messages to her organization. It's wonderful. It's a wonderful book. And the book is called The BeeKeeper: Pollinating Your Organization for Transformative Growth, a leadership fable, which I love it. I love it. So bravo, guys.
Thank you.
The book is really, really great. I was surprised, Katie, when I saw the chapters, and I went in and I was immediately looking for it. You know what I'm going to say here. I was looking for, where's the one on Be Creative, right? So maybe in the second round we scoop that one up, because that's a big topic for me.
But Bill, I want to just pull on that thread for a moment. That I love that you kind of extracted that and you're calling that out, because this is something we want to inspire readers to think about. The bee mindsets that we have in the book, right, have obvious leadership learnings and undertones, but we want readers to think about bee mindsets that aren't there. We're not limited to the bee mindsets that are in the book. And so for someone like you, right, in that creative space, right, the be creative is something that fuels the way that you're able to be curious, and the way that you're able to be nourished, and the way that you're able to be transformational, right? So for that piece, it's about the reflection, right? Like, what's resonating, but like, how do I enact this, right, as Bill Childs?
Right. I want to ask Michael, like, what's been your feedback on your end, from, your, colleagues who maybe have read the book?
Yeah, it's super humbling to, really, really interesting. When we launched, really, you don't know what's going to happen when you launch a book, but I think humbling is really the appropriate word. Across industries, whether it's salespeople, sales leaders, whether it's educators, whether it's sports teams and athletic directors. I mean, we are getting a lot of interest in just the message. So seeing the reviews on Amazon and seeing the reviews come through on email, it's just been really awesome to see. So regardless of industry, I think people are gravitating to kind of the message in the BeeKeeper about how you can kind of put yourself at the center of someone's growth and help an organization, a team, an individual grow. And then from an age group perspective, even we're seeing a lot of kids student athletes pick up the book and kind of have it resonate with them as well. So we're seeing a lot of different ways people are using it. In fact, it was just at a book club this week with a number of female entrepreneurs that we did a session on, and it was really great to see. Katie and I have been kind of talking about, you know, what do these conversations look like when people want to engage in using this through their book clubs. So wide variety of you know, age groups, genders, and obviously certainly industry.
What I also liked about in the book too is when it gets to the end and she kind of goes back to the company, you know, she's met with a little resistance, which
Mhm.
we have to talk about, because not everybody's going to be, you know, not everybody walks through the world with an open heart and an open mind and reads a book like this and says, yeah, let's do it. You know, there's those naysayers, those people that are just like, you know. So what I want to ask is, have you guys ever worked in like what would be considered like a toxic environment? And what was your experience with that? And how did you navigate it? What, you know, let's talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, so I could take this one, and I'll say yes, I have. And I actually just had a conversation with someone recently about this because I think sometimes like our training, right, in leadership development, it is a blessing and a curse, right? So there's also high accountability for we better enact what we espouse to teach and to, right, encourage people to do as leaders. And so in this specific instance, working with a toxic leader, I actually felt the emotional responses personally. And it was actually a great moment for me to learn about myself and to learn about what I care about and the passion that I put behind my work. But it also goes back to that space of, we can't wallow in our own self-misery, and we have to be part of the change. And so it took me time, right? And leaning on the members of my star system to acknowledge that there were real emotions tied to the impact of working with an emotional or a toxic leader. But then also, what am I going to do about it? I'm not going to sit back and admire the problem, right? But how do I become part of the solution? And that's really about taking care of the people around me to make sure that we're progressing. So there was a space there of like, even when I'm in like coaching, how am I putting myself in the shoes of people who are saying like, I work in a toxic environment. How do we unpack this? Right. And I could draw on some of that experience, to think about that.
How about you, Michael?
Yeah, I think there's always elements of, opportunities to get better as organizations. Worked in a lot of different companies. Certainly, leaders and managers have an opportunity to kind of think through how they're working with their teams and what kind of environment they're creating. And so, yeah, when it does happen and when we do see kind of a cultural shift from, hey, this may have some cultural implications, I think interventions are really important, and catching that early and making sure that someone is placing themselves, kind of going back to the theme of the book, at the center of that cultural transformation, and saying, hey, we've identified this opportunity and now we need to kind of act on it to make sure it doesn't get toxic. But I think it's that awareness of, hey, could this be a cultural problem down the road, and addressing it very quickly and swiftly so it doesn't kind of permeate through the organization.
Well, they say that the number one reason people will leave a job is because of a bad boss.
You're
Not
right.
money, it's not opportunity, it's not, the work or the company. It's usually a bad boss.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And
for sure.
I'll tell you what I think, lesson that I got from the book is that the bees all know what they need to do, and they do it, and they work together. Now that sounds very simple, right? That sounds like almost like ridiculously simple. But yet, you bring in the human element and we complicate it. So ego comes into play, right? And it just, things get very sticky and very weird very fast, right? I just think that there's so much more we can all do if we all just work together. And I know that sounds oversimplified, but I think that's the message of the book. Work together. Know what your role is, support each other, help each other, and all those things. Be vulnerable, be curious, be, empathetic, things that they don't, I don't think they really teach maybe they do now. I mean, Katie, you could talk to this in business. I mean, are you teaching that in your class? I would imagine you would be, right? How to
Yeah,
be
yeah,
empathetic, how to, let go of your ego. Don't let that drive your decisions. Be more vulnerable. People get very uncomfortable with vulnerability, right?
yeah,
You go
yeah,
to meetings sometimes, and I talk about this a lot on the podcast, where one of the greatest things a leader can do is, if a question comes up that they don't know the answer to, say, I don't know the answer,
yeah. I
right?
know. Don't escalate commitment to the wrong thing. You're
Right,
absolutely right.
right. And you can build, and you know what? I don't know a lot about that. Can you teach me? Will you show me? And now you got the person that you're working with, you're building trust. They're going to want to help you learn about that problem. It just kind of builds off itself. But so many people in leadership positions feel they have to have all the answers, because that's
Yeah,
why they're in that position. They need to have all those answers. And I say, no, you don't. Be open
you're
to,
so right.
yeah.
And Bill, you're kind of pulling on, and you mentioned this earlier that, effective leaders really, and these are your words, right, have an open heart and open mind. And in that space, right, one of the chapters is be growth minded. But that's really that, goes back to Mike's message of the art of learning to be proximal is about keeping yourself at the core, at the heart
Mhm.
of learning and growth. And as leaders, we have to be mindful, and I'm always really challenged in this space as a mom, right, to a 9 and 11-year-old that they both want to be treated different than I do. They both learn different than I do. They see the world different than I do. And so, how do I show up as their mom and learn with them? Right. And then that's transferred into how we work with adults, right? To say, like, well, that's an interesting perspective because, that's not necessarily how I see it, but how do I listen to understand instead of listen to respond, to kind of welcome those differences? But two, we're not going to do that in an environment that's not safe. And so the role of the beekeeper is to create that safe environment for the bees to do what they do best, and that's to work together. And so in those opportunities, right, we really have to think about that foundational piece, because in a lot of ways, people are fearful to say, I don't know. Right. And so we go back to that space that we're creating, that people can really show up to learn and grow every day, right, to just try to be better tomorrow.
Yeah. What about Michael? You can take this question. Tell me about a leader that you worked with that inspired you, or an inspiring leader you admire. Could be someone you worked with, or maybe it's someone you haven't worked with.
Yeah,
A
for
leader
sure. I
that
think
inspires you.
yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think there's so many different ways to think about inspiration. I think, it's really important in organizations in general for us to encourage leaders to share kind of their framework or leadership philosophy, or what kind of inspired them. And when we do that at a corporate level and get people creating that environment of vulnerability where they're sharing who they are and how they lead, it really kind of gives you some insights into different perspectives. And I can remember one leader in particular, inspired me to kind of get out of my comfort zone. And you can get very complacent in doing what you're doing and apathetic and just like, going through the motions. And by putting yourself in challenging situations, it really helps you grow. And the analogy that he used was, to kind of put yourself in the deep end of the pool where you're always treading water and you're not comfortable sitting lounging around. And that's when the best growth happens. And so I've always kind of taken that mindset of, when I feel like I'm comfortable, is to like put myself in a new role or a new job, or take a stretch assignment, or do something different that is going to challenge me to help me grow. And Katie and I publish a lot on this in the space of flow, and that's kind of the impetus for that, right? When you put yourself in a situation where you don't have the skills and the knowledge to meet the challenge, you quickly start growing and developing those, and that's when you get in the zone. And so it's I think the leader who inspired me, probably provided that's probably the best guidance I've gotten, that's helped me grow personally and professionally and inspired me.
Okay. Katie, how about you?
Yeah, so I'm thinking as Mike was talking, so many people have influenced and touched my life, but I go back to, a college faculty member who is really the reason that I ended up going into academia. So, I was working 6.5 years in corporate marketing, and she called me and said, I want you to come back and teach a sport marketing class. And I said no 5 times before I said yes. And, in the spirit of what Mike just shared, like I really moved myself way out of my comfort zone. And also, it was a Pygmalion effect moment that like, I didn't see the things that she saw in me. And, she then inspired action where then I started to believe in myself, and then it propelled, right? I mean, going into something I love so much. Like I can't imagine if I stayed in the career I was in, right? Because I didn't have near the passion for the work that I do today. And so much of that I think has fueled how I lead, how I work with students, how I identify the things I see in people to help them believe in themselves, to continue to kind of, that ripple effect.
It's amazing. Back to what Michael was saying, I have the phrase that I always think of is get comfortable with being uncomfortable. And I think I've used that in my presentations in your class already.
Yep.
I want to ask, and maybe Michael, you can take this one. What do you see as the biggest challenge facing leaders today as new generations enter the workforce?
Yeah, this is a great question. And we talk a lot about this in general. I think self-awareness and recognition of, kind of these deep level diversity attributes that people bring to the table. Oftentimes we're thinking about, maybe they're the intelligence of someone, can they do the job? But we really don't dive deep enough what's under the surface and what's informed individuals and what makes them tick and what drives them and motivates them. And we may have a perception of, the different generations. And I also think that's probably wrong approach, because there's a lot of literature on that. And it's really getting to know the people, who they are as human beings, to really make those decisions versus generalizing, in these big swooping, buckets of they're part of this generation, so they must do this. And while that there's probably some, accuracy to some of those behaviors, I mean, it's really the human being that's going to, dictate how they want to be treated. And that goes back to what Katie mentioned about really unlearning a little bit of like, oh, treat people the way, they want to be treated. Or you want to be treated, but instead treat them as they want to be treated. And that's getting to know the person regardless of, what generation they're in. So I think organizations and companies need to kind of take a step back and say, are we generalizing? How do we kind of sit down and talk to the person and find out what they need and how they can best contribute to our culture, as an organization.
Right. Katie, how about you?
Yeah, I want to add to what Mike just shared, and that comes down to, let's remove ego. And when we're bringing, especially younger people into the organization, let's create a space that we could lead from every seat, right? How do we share talents? How do we learn from each other? How do we create a space where you could say like, wow, like I never experienced that in all my years of work. And I love that you're bringing in this perspective, like show me, right? Help me understand what's the resonance there. But that's also the space of like putting aside, like, well, I've been here for so many, let's never use that phrase. And to Mike's point, let's come in, right? What's harder for adults than learning is unlearning. But that takes that place of, your ability and willingness to be vulnerable, to say like, well, I never thought of it that way, right? Great perspective. And you'll appreciate this in the work that you do. Like maybe that message will land better, right? If I'm thinking about the receiver instead of what I want to say or what makes sense in my mind.
Okay. I love that. I'm not sure if you know this, but I recently took a position at LCTI. I teach advertising design now.
Love this.
This year was my first year. And
so fitting.
Well, that's what a lot of people say. But I'll tell you what, boy, did I make a lot of mistakes. And boy, did I learn a lot about myself that first year. Oh my God. And Monday is year 2 and I'm going in. The first year, I was in a dangerous position because I didn't know what I didn't know. Now I know what I don't know. See what I mean? Difference there. I kind of went in and I made the mistake of thinking, because I was at LCTI, Lehigh County Votech. I studied there 39 years ago. I'm teaching the class that I was in. So talk about a full circle moment. So I went in there thinking these designers or these students were all just me 39 years later. Not the case at all. Not the case at all. So I had to engage every single thing in this, probably why it resonated with me so much. I had to engage everything in this book that first year. And it where it really came full circle for me was I did an exercise with them at the end of the year. And I said, guys, I said, listen, here's what I want you to do. You're going to be moving on to level 2. I want you to write a letter to an incoming student. And I want you to tell them what you liked about the class, what you didn't like about the class, what you learned in the class, and what this student who's going to be reading this, how to get the most out of the class. And I thought that was a pretty cool idea, right? Until my supervisor said, you have to read those letters, right? And I was like, oh, but that's not how I set it up. So I read the letters. And I can tell you that I could only get through 2 of them at a time because they broke me down. They got it. They got it. They got everything I was trying to teach them about getting out of their comfort zone, challenging themselves. I brought in a public speaking component to the class. They did talks every Friday. They hated it at first, but at the end they were like, that helped. That's going to help me in other classes. And it was great to be able to read those letters and get the feedback that I was so desperately needing, but they weren't going to tell me, but they told in the letters to the students. Now, I just think to myself that everything I thought I knew about leadership, I had to go kind of like a little bit out the window when it came to teaching, because everybody learns differently. It's like an organization. It's like I'm leading this team, but they all learn differently. Some are more visual. Some want the rubric. They want to know like how they're going to be able to get the high score, and you have to be able to adjust your approach. And I had to be able to adjust my approach to that. So I'm excited about going into what I call season 2. Because I can bring in all that stuff that I've learned the first year now to the second year.
Bill, I got the chills when you said, the letters broke me down. It's the piece of like teaching and, I think really in just like helping people see what they can do, how they could be better, right? And then that seeing the transformation or watching the progression of that growth is like, there's no price tag on it.
Nope.
But 2, what you're sharing with listeners right now is really, the spirit of be growth minded. The learning never stops. Like we make a lot of mistakes as adults all the time, right? But how do we see them and say like, what do I want to do about this, right? Do I want to just continue to do that and escalate commitment that like, too bad, so sad? Or am I going to say I'm going to pivot and adjust, right? And try to see it better or do it different or prioritize energy in a different way. And, that's something I think in all spaces in our life that like we have an opportunity as leaders to not miss that.
Yeah. Michael, did you ever have a teacher that kind of, maybe inspired you or saw something in you that you maybe didn't even see for you? Because that's one of the things that I love about what teaching can do is a good leader or a good teacher, and a teacher is a leader, when they see something in someone that person doesn't even see in themselves yet. And then when you see that those 2 things kind of come together, wow, talk about magic.
Yeah, I'd like to think so. I mean, they no one's directly told me anything like that, but what I can tell you about my experience with my professors and teachers is that, I always gravitated towards like a smaller school where I could, have a more intimate and close relationship with the teachers, because, I think I learned a ton that way, and that's how I learned. And going back to kind of learning styles and how people best learn, I needed that interaction. And my teachers ended up being really my close, colleagues down the road. I've leaned on them for mentorship, for assisting me as I went on my academic journey. And so they inspired me to kind of want to get into academia because of that nice relationship that that environment they created where we can continue our relationship after college and after school. So I think inherently, without saying it, I think you can tell that people kind of encouraged me to kind of go into academics and do that down the road. So it was certainly a good feeling when professors want to collaborate after you graduate with them or from the school and say, hey, let's do something together. That's kind of an undertone of they saw something in me, I believe. So
Absolutely. And Katie, you get to experience that in your role, certainly, right?
Yeah, quite frequently. And I'll echo what Mike said is, I think that's where, and I hear from alums all the time, right? But the relationships evolve, right? And there's reciprocity of teaching and learning, right? Where I might have someone in the classroom, but I can learn just as much from them as they may have learned from me. And how do you continue to, evolve and invest in those relationships and the people that you come across on your journey?
I kind of equated teaching to surfing, in the sense that there's days that you're going to just all the way, you're going to hit all the waves. They're all going to come in. You're going to ride them all in perfectly, and it's going to be wow. And then you go, I'm doing that tomorrow. No, you're not. No, you're not. The next day, you can't even get up on the board, and you got to be okay with that. And I struggled a little bit with that at the beginning of the year in my role, because I wanted to duplicate that amazing experience every day. I couldn't even duplicate it. I had 2 classes, so I have an AM and a PM. I was even not able to do it. If the AM was like a great surfing day, the PM would be like crash and burn. I'd be like eating sand all day, and then think like, well, what did I didn't do anything different. So it's that mindset. It's getting that your head around the fact that like, this is just what it is, and I know I made the mistake. This was the biggest mistake. I went in. I went in thinking I was the creative director of this young agency, and these were all the designers, and I'm going to teach them all. Like, we're like, oh, that was like, whoa, no, not at all. It's a level 1 class, so really, I'm kind of teaching them like the basics, visual literacy, color, type. We're not diving deep into paragraph styles and InDesign. It's more about getting them to get uncomfortable with being uncomfortable, coming out of their comfort zone. I told them that, I said, my job is to assign projects to you to help you discover yourself. And your job is to show up for that process. See how simple that is? That's I can't make that any more simple. Just like the bees can't make it any more simple. Like if you knew nothing about leadership and you read this book and you applied those principles, you'd be an awesome, amazing leader, and you'd succeed beyond your wildest dreams.
Yeah, two things I want to say, Bill, that in your example is, first, the surfing analogy is, I think we have to acknowledge every day that we're human, right? And we are going to have good moments and bad moments. We're going to have up days and down days, right? But let's not like stay down. Like, let's not, right? Let's pick ourselves back up, right? And get back on the board again.
Yeah.
And use those as learning moments. But 2, there's also, the book is about you choosing who and how you want to be as a leader. And we get to choose that. Like, we author our own story, and our story impacts every single person that we touch along the journey, right? And so in that space, there's things like, and this was resonating as you were saying, like, I might have a section A and section B, and it might be 2 completely different experiences. And like, I remember kind of like the turning the mirror, moment for me as a faculty member, where I was like, wow, like, I'm a high energy person, but why do I feel so tired and depleted, going into like the last class of the day? Well, I'm an introvert. And so, that was like me having the aha moment that like, I need alone time to recharge my batteries before I go into that next class of like, not a lot of stimulation and not a lot of interaction and not a lot of, because I can't bring my best self to interact with those students. But how do you give yourself permission to be you, right? How do you give yourself permission to say, like, I'm not going to do it the way Mike does, but we're going to get to the same goal in really different ways.
I love that. It's true. It's true. So I can tell you, I was in the field for 39 years. I did advertising and marketing, and I was a designer and all that kind of stuff, billboards, newspaper. I was at an agency for 6 years. And I told this story a couple of times on the podcast when it came to leadership. I was at Adams Outdoor for 2 years, where I met the most inspirational leader that I've ever experienced. His approach to leadership was this upside down pyramid. So in most leadership structures, the pyramid, the leader's at the top of the pyramid, right? Kind of like everybody is underneath supporting that person at the top. In his approach, he was at the bottom of the pyramid. The pyramid was inverted, and he was at the bottom holding everyone else up, making sure they had what they needed, the tools that they needed to do and talk about that safe environment. He created that safe environment. This is a person who would be in meetings, either creative sessions or sales meetings, And I didn't even realize how amazing this was until after I left the company. He would always be in the room. He was the general manager. He was in charge of everybody. He was the beekeeper. And he let everyone else conduct the meeting and only would respond when someone would ask him a question. He was not interjecting. He was not trying to put his stamp on what was happening. He let the bees do their work. And I just thought that was so, and if someone would ask him a question, he would be like E.F. Hutton, that old commercial where, E.F. Hutton says, an old reference, everybody stops because they don't want to listen. And he would always do that pause because he was thinking. He never would just you knew he had to think about the answer because he wanted it to be correct. And I just thought, talk about a master class in leadership. And sadly, I only got to experience that 2 years out of 39 years. But I'm glad I got to experience that because boy, did that inform me and how I took everything I learned from him and brought it into all the other places that I worked at as a creative director, as a marketing director. I was able to kind of bring his leadership style. And now that I'm thinking about it, he was the ultimate beekeeper. That's what he did. He just tended to the hive. He let the bees do what they needed to do. I remember the one time I said to him, John, you want me to run this creative session? I don't know what happens in a creative session. And he said, that's for you to figure out. He says, all I can tell you is that I want you to give the reps the ability to speak intelligently about good design. That's it. Simple. You see the connection here about how a lot of this stuff is very simple, but we complicate it so much. You look at a billboard on the road anymore, there's 70 words on it. Who's reading that? Simple. Keep it simple. Yeah. So, 2 years, I got to experience it. So it can, Katie, to your point, it can be magic. It really can you feel lit up inside when you're working with an inspired leader, or you're working in an organization where there's a mission and it's not just make money. There's a real mission behind it. You can do transformative work. You really can. It can really feel amazing. So
you're so right. I can't wait for John to hear what you just said about him.
I did a whole podcast.
I did. I love it.
Podcast with him. He's my Zen guru on the mountain, and has been for all these years. Anytime I made a career move, I would talk to John, and that's what an inspired leader does for people. But I did a whole podcast with him, 2 episodes back in season 3. So
I love that.
So I have a question. With the success of the book, are you guys going to write another one? I have to put you on the spot.
Katie and I love to publish, so it's definitely we've gotten such great results from this book, and our publisher has already come to us and has talked to us about that. So that's very rewarding in and of itself. And I think they gave great advice. They're like, enjoy this journey, keep it going. You've got a great book, but you have an opportunity now to kind of think about maybe replicating this. And so yeah, certainly Katie and I will look at doing that down the road. Katie, I don't know if I want to chime in and add your thoughts there.
Yeah, Mike and I are really goal oriented. And so we're always talking about ideas, for what's next, but I'll be excited to see, similar to this book, right? It wasn't the first imagination of what we talked about. And so as we're talking about what's next, I'm excited to see how that kind of evolves into the next output, and however that follows this.
I hope you still have that pizza box.
Oh yeah, we do. We do.
All right. Okay, Kate, that's an awesome story. I love it. And I do love how I wrote this down in my book. It says, place yourself at the core of learning and growth. And you brought it up as well. And I do love that, because we don't talk about it. I don't think we don't talk about it enough in school, that, you're not going to stop. You're never going to stop learning. You should never stop learning. You should never want to stop learning. So it really is, it's lifelong, and it's get used to that now, because, you need it if you're gonna stay innovative, if you're gonna stay current, if you're gonna stay, up to date on what's going on. You got to be open. You have to be open to it. You have to be open enough to the fact to realize that you don't have all the answers, and you might not ever have the answers.
Yeah.
Right? Why do so many leaders misunderstand that? Why?
Yeah. Well, Bill, so you're actually illuminating right at the end of the book. We learn, and like spoiler alert for listeners who haven't read yet, at the end we use the learnings of bees and traditional beekeepers, right, in how we create a thriving hive. But at the end of the book, right, we kind of illuminate that as leaders, we're dropping that second E, and we're saying as leaders, we want you to be beekeepers, BE, right? You get to choose who and how you want to be. And so even if like you've been authoring a story for the last 40 years and you're reflecting back and saying like, wow, I was pretty fixed, or wow, I'm really not showing up learning. I'm escalating commitment to like, I'm the expert, right? I'm the one with all the experience and I don't have anything to learn. It's not too late to turn the page, right? And to start to author that space of saying like, well, let me show up curious. And let me listen to understand, and let me lean in. And similar to what Catherine, the protagonist in the book, does, is she doesn't even want to go on this, vacation to a farm. And she's imagining it's going to be just horrible. But when she gets there and she comes with an open mind and an open heart, right, she meets Henry. That kind of inspires that lens check moment, similar to the moment you had at commencement to say, oh my gosh, I'm here, right? And I'm interacting, I'm meeting someone that's giving me the opportunity to reflect, right? To be present, to think about, the interaction on this vacation, but then how that propels back to the organization. And I think so many times in life, like we come across people who can inspire us to think about things in a different way or to choose a different lens. But if we're not open to it, we won't see it, right? And we won't embrace the opportunity to do that.
100%. Michael, I'll tell you a quick story and I want to get your opinion on it because it has to do with sales. So I went into sales for 2 years because I'm somebody that if I can do a job and I get too comfortable with it, I need a new challenge. So I was at the morning call and I went into sales for 2 years and I sold a product called the single sheet insert. It was inserts in the Sunday paper. Okay. So no one taught me. They taught me the basic skills of like, this is the product, this is what it costs, this is how it works. Okay. I got that. So I started talking to customers and I would go see them and I would listen, I would ask questions, and we'd get to the end of the sales call and I would know they're not right for this. Like this is a specialized, like kind of like niche, kind of like they're not at the point where they could use this, but I'm going to lose the sale. Okay. Mm-hmm. So they would say, okay, what do you think? And I would say, you know what, I got to tell you, I don't think this product's right for you. I think you need to be in the newspaper and attract a wider net. Because this is really, if you're going to do an insert, you really need to know where your customers are coming from. And we don't know that yet. Mm-hmm. And boy, did that change the dynamic in the call, because what they would say is, well, but you were here for 2 hours and you're not going to make the sale. And I would say this because I didn't know what else to say. This is just what I said. I said, that's not what I'm not here for me. I'm here for you. Right. And I wasn't feeding them a line. That's just how I felt in my heart. And they said, okay, well, we feel bad. I'm like, don't feel bad. Mm-hmm. I'm here to help you. And right now I'm telling you, you need to kind of know where your customers are coming from. And I said, listen, and in 6 months, if you know that, call me back. Do you know every single person called me back and I made that sale 6 months later? Now to a sales manager hearing this story, they might be like, what an idiot, right? Because you have a goal in right now and you're walking away from money. You're walking away from your goal. Well, maybe it's why I only did it for 2 years, but I was more looking at it like what was the best for the customer. So can you talk to a little bit about that as someone who's in sales? Was I doing the right thing, or was I kind of, what should I have done there?
I mean, certainly you're doing the right thing, right? I mean, that's a great story that I think, should resonate with a lot of different, sales professionals. I think many of us, when we take that approach of customer centricity and kind of understand the needs of the customer versus kind of our own needs, the sales will happen down the road. Those are seeds that you planted, certainly early on that, bear fruit later on. And I think customer interactions like that are really important. And so, just having been in sales, we've all been in those situations where you may feel like there's a, pressure to hit a sales number. But, if you take a step back and say, what really are we doing for the customer? Though, like I said, those will bear fruit later on. And you just got, the more activity that you do, the more interactions with the customers you have, the easier it'll be to establish those relationships and trust. So you can perform at a high level, consistently, which is kind of what salespeople want to do, right? It's not these moments in time. It's, creating an environment that you can have consistent sales performance growth over time, and do things for the good of the, the good of the firm and the good of the organization. But also being mindful of like, hey, there's a bigger picture here of really helping the customers understand, what they need to help grow their business. And I think most salespeople hopefully have that lens with their customers.
And I was just thinking about this now as you were talking. I leaned in to my be curious. This is really
Yeah.
because I would just ask questions like, why did you start this business? Wow, this is really interesting. How long, where do you see yourself in 5 years? I just would ask questions, and within those questions would come the answers that I would need about, whether or not I could help them or not. But sometimes I would spend 2 hours and I would make the sale, and because I thought this is right for your business. But I wasn't comfortable selling something to someone that I knew wasn't going to benefit them. And all it was going to do was I was going to take their money and it wouldn't work and I'd never see them again. So I kind of
Well,
went down.
kudos to you for doing that, right? That's important to recognize. And the curiosity is kind of those intangible skills that, you really need to have in sales, because the curious salesperson is really a successful salesperson, in my opinion.
But I never felt like I was doing it right. I felt like even though I was doing what was right by the customer, I didn't feel like I was doing it right. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I mean, it's turning turning down an opportunity, potentially to sell something is tough. But I mean, you did do it right. I mean, I would shift the lens there. The right way to do it is to look at, what the customers need and what they want. And it sounds like you referred a different, competitor or a different kind of product. And I think, equally you need to be, all salespeople need to be well versed in what's out there, especially if they have the customer in mind, competition and all.
Well, the good thing about that was that the competition I was referring it to, I worked at the paper too. So I
Oh,
was
good. Okay.
send out another rep to go.
Referring it to another company.
Right. It wasn't another company, but
Mhm.
even with that kind of stuff, I always told people at the agency, never badmouth the competition. Like, don't do that. It's not a
Right.
good, you know, there's just don't do it. Don't go down that road. So, and what I didn't realize at the time was how that dot was going to connect for me in the future. Because as a creative person, as someone who had to sell creative, I had to learn how to
Mhm.
talk to customers and how to kind of pull out the points of, what makes this campaign, why I think this campaign is going to be successful. So even though I wasn't the greatest salesperson in the world, that dot connected in a big way when I got into the agency and had to kind of sell creative as a creative director.
Yeah,
So
well, I mean, that goes back to your whole point of like being proximal, right? I mean, being proximal is, proximal by definition is putting yourself at the center, like it's the center of the body. So if you think about it medically, it's really the center, your torso, you're closest to your heart. And so we want people to think about that as placing themselves at the center of learning and growth. And so when you, as a creative director, or you as a salesperson, really place yourself at the center of your customers' growth, what do they need? What's going to help them grow their business? All of this kind of then kind of transcends and says they're doing it for the right reasons. They have our best interest in mind, and that there's more commitment to, work with you, and more relationship and trust that's built, whether you're selling a product or helping someone achieve a career goal. I think that's being proximal in those situations is really important.
yeah, and I think in that scenario, everybody wins. Everybody wins, right? It's not just
Mhm.
like one person winning over another, or making the sale and then just moving on to the next, knowing that like, well, I'll never see them again because that's it's not going to work. So
Mhm.
interesting. I wanted to ask both of you, what's something that you wish you knew when you were starting out that you know now? Like a
Okay, do you
lesson
want to take that
you have
first?
known, kind of like, maybe like a lesson you learned the hard way, or like, boy, I wish I would have known that 20 years ago, because I got like 75 of them that I could share with you. One of them, I'll give you an example. One of them for me is, I wish I would have known growing up how closely aligned failure is to success, because I always treated it as polar opposites, and they're not. They need each other. So that's one for me, is that if you're not, failure and success need each other, because if you're failing, it means you're trying things you're not comfortable doing, and that's how you're going to grow. That's how you're going to learn. So that's a big one for me. So what do you
Yeah, I
guys
get
have? Go ahead.
I think a big one for me, goes back to something you opened with earlier, Bill, is that there's so much strength and courage and vulnerability. And as a young person, I think I struggled, right? I was an athlete my whole life and, played through college and very focused on the outcome, right? And the, personal performance and really not thinking about that space of like saying, I don't know, or, I have a lot to learn, or, there's almost a humility that I think I developed over time. But that really came in safe spaces, right? With mentors and people that helped me to realize, right, what can happen when you kind of lean into the vulnerabilities, and something I really try to model, today as a professional, and of course in my personal space.
How about you, Michael?
Yeah, and so when we think about a lesson that maybe I learned early on that I think I can apply that applies today, being patient, kind of coming out of our book as a B mindset, it was really important. I think early on was very focused on achievement and goal oriented, which is great, right? Like getting to the next level, getting to the next promotion, getting to the next career spot in my life, you're making the next, dollar. And I think that's great. I think we should be goal oriented and have a high sense of achievement. However, the be patient mindset is critical, because when you can kind of step away and say, okay, maybe I don't need to make a little more money or get a new job title. Maybe I need to do something different and take a demotion, or maybe even move laterally to get a new skill and acquire new things so I can be the best version of myself and the best organizational asset. That is more meaningful, I think, to organizations and individually in teams, when you can have a broader perspective on the business, more skills. But oftentimes early on, I was very focused on moving through quickly. And I've recognized very quickly that it's okay to be patient, do new things, try new things, challenge yourself. And then your career will grow exponentially when you have those skills that you've acquired to, achieve, your ultimate goal, which is, obviously contributing to the firm or the organization, and then, being a good organizational asset, for the company. So be patient, I think, is something I wish I learned very early, and not rush through things.
Yeah, I can agree with that one. And you know what? You do that, you make an impact, which is the biggest thing of all. You impact the people around you, you impact your coworkers, you impact your clients, you have impact. So, I'm just, I'm curious about this. Were there any, in writing the book, were there any like disagreements or arguments that you guys had or was it pretty easy to like decide the writing of it? Curious about that.
I think we get this question a lot, almost on every interview podcast we do, because people talk about co-authorship and how difficult of a road that is. But if Katie and I probably didn't have our 10 years worth of experience writing in academic journals and going through very rigorous review processes where we're getting critical feedback and having to navigate it, the peer review process, perhaps that could have happened. But I think we both know how to work with each other. And there weren't too many really difficult disagreements, right, Katie? But I do think that there's one incident. I don't know if you want to talk about the work-life balance thing. So I think it was something that we talked about that had meaningful dialogue that ended up, really resonating in the book.
Yeah. So, Mike illuminates, right? He and I are growth partners. So we have tough conversations and we disagree with each other probably on a daily basis, right? But we learn from each other, right? But we have such high, respect for one another that I think it's easier to have those conversations to say like a completely different way, right? And we could walk away from it and come back and revisit it. And to his point, the work-life balance was one where he said, when you go on vacation, you shouldn't be sending emails. And I said, okay, well, that's the golden rule. Maybe that's what you want to do. But if we're enacting the platinum rule, right, there are people who go on vacation, and I'm one of them. And, I know people who have all different kinds of, approaches that, it might be really stressful to completely shut down, and they want to check in, or they want to just let, especially if you're, an entrepreneur, that you want your people to know that you're there if they need you, right? You're not going to create an environment where you're working your whole vacation. And so he's like, oh, it's a good point. So we're like, how do we compromise to like, everyone has a different style of balance, and we operationalize balance in different ways as humans. How do we allow people the opportunity to unplug and refuel in the way that makes sense to them? And so Catherine, right, very intentionally sent those very early emails, right, on Monday mornings, even as though she was writing them, right, at night or over the weekend. She's like, I'm not sending it until the morning. And so, it was about kind of just understanding, difference of, how people operationalize balance.
All right. We're near the end. I'm going to ask each of you this, and this is a big one. How do you define success? What does success look like to you personally?
I think success, obviously different for everybody, but for me, it's growth. I think that if I'm learning something new, doing something new, I think you're demonstrating success. Certainly there's a lot of ways to define success, but like I know that when I'm growing, I feel like I'm successful in life.
And that's one thing that aligns for me. Growth is one of my core values. And so it's just a fabric of my being, right? And so I'm not successful unless I'm just ongoing learning and growth, but that's really like mind, body, soul for me.
Guys, this was a lot
How
of
about
fun.
you, Bill? How do you define success?
For
Curious.
me, I think, you know what? I've had a lot of conversations about this. And my wife, Kelly, helped me with this one. Really impact. The impact I leave for the people that I've helped, and the people that I've helped, especially now with teaching, and setting them up for their future. I think that's where what I love about teaching so much is that I get to play a role in their journey. I'm meeting them on this path. We're only together for 10 months. And then, can I have an impact on their life in a positive way?
Love that. I love that.
And
So
I don't know
powerful.
how you put a price tag on that, because
no, you don't. There's no price tag.
The one letter that I got was not a letter that was put into the pile that was written for a former student. It was written directly to me. And this girl put it on my desk. She didn't hand it to me. And I keep it with me, and I'll probably always have it with me, because I felt she had talent, but she didn't see herself as talented. She didn't. Every time I tried to say, this is really good, she's like, no, it's not. I'm like, no, it's really good. You're good. And she wrote something that just went right into my heart, because she was like, thank you for never giving up on me. See, I can't even talk about it. I start getting emotional. You never gave up on me. You never, your passion for me wanting to get better never wavered. I will miss this class. You had a great year. Thank you for being a great teacher. And she doesn't want to go into art, but she showed up every day for the process, sometimes unwillingly. And she felt like I helped her. Like I in the sense that I didn't give up on her. Do you know what I mean? It would have been easy to kind of give up on her. It would have been easy to just kind of just say, like, you're not really suited for that. And I would never tell anyone that, really suited for this. Maybe you should look to get, I didn't do that. I kept at it with her, and it resonated with her. And this was a tough girl. This wasn't a girl that was like, something that was easy to kind of like write something like that. I didn't even know she was capable of that type of deep emotion, and she was. So to me, that's impact. That's
and what you're identifying is like the reciprocity of impact, right? So you impacting her, and then that feeling that you get back of being able to give in that way. It's so powerful. I love it.
I'm surprised how much when these kids, because so many of these kids they really are talented. And I don't think a lot of people are telling them that, because when I tell them, they get very uncomfortable. They're almost like, well, you have to say that, you're our teacher. I'm like, no, I don't. If I don't like something that you're doing, I don't have to tell you I like it just because I want to. I don't. First of all, that's not who I am. I'm not going to be that person, but I'll find something good if I believe it, and then I'm going to tell you. But they get uncomfortable with it. They get uncomfortable with the compliments. And when someone is telling them that you're doing good, keep going. I love this phrase. One of my art teachers told me, make an intelligent mess. That's all I need you to do. Make an intelligent mess. I can tell when
I love that.
I can tell when
be messy.
Yeah, it doesn't matter if you might look at it and feel like it's a failure, but I'm looking at it and thinking, yeah, but look at how much it improved from the previous project. You're on the path. Keep going. Don't get discouraged. So, guys, I love talking to you. I could talk all day about this. This is a topic that I think is much needed leadership. I love the book so much. I tell everybody about it. And I when I posted it to LinkedIn, there's a couple people, I think that one of my friends said, this is exactly what I was looking for. So I think I might have been able to help you move a couple copies. So I don't know if
Thank you.
but
We're so grateful.
I do
Appreciate you.
Yeah, I really did get into it. And I'm being serious about that. I read it. And as soon as I read it, I reached out to you, Katie, and I said, I want to have you guys on my podcast. And you were like, absolutely. Tell me when. And here we are. So thank you for doing this. I'm appreciative. I'm being appreciative right now. And I would say one last B to you would be well.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you, Bill.
Likewise.
Thanks so much. Thanks for having us. This was a blast.
Take care.
Thanks, Bill.
Bye-bye.
All right, AdYackers. Hope you enjoyed it, because we have many more great conversations planned and guests lined up ready to yak it up. AdYack is sponsored and produced by ASR Media. Theme song was written and performed by Dan Ross. AdYack is the official podcast of the AAF Greater Lehigh Valley Ad Club. Stay hungry, stay humble. Till next time.
This episode of AdYack is rated O for, oh man, that was good.